Joining us, MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell, MS Now White House reporter Laura Barone-Lopez, MS Now legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher, and senior editor at the Free Press, Joe Nocera. All right, so Michael, we've heard from Massey, we've heard from Khanna, we've heard from Mace, we've heard from some former reps like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Is there a concerted push beyond those people to put more pressure? I'm going to talk about the Republican side because the Democrats, I imagine I know where they stand, to put pressure on Pam Bondi to release more files.
I mean, look, Katie, it's tough to tell right now because Congress is out of session, so lawmakers have the luxury of only having to respond to news articles or news stories or news of the day if they want to. They're not prompted by reporters in the hallways. But I will note we are hearing a lot of concerns and criticism of that letter that Pam Bondi had sent to Congress. And by the way, that was required by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, that within 15 days of all the files being released, that letter outlining the redactions had to be sent to Congress. And I had spoken to a number of lawmakers over the recent weeks who kept telling me that they were looking forward to reading that letter because there were a lot of concerns about how the DOJ went forward with those redactions, victims' names and personal identification information being out in the public, some high-profile, high-powered individuals, their names being redacted. There was a lot of this concern that were only, by the way, mounting after members of Congress were able to go behind closed doors and view the unredacted material to actually find out what the DOJ had left in and left out. This letter is only accentuating those concerns because their questions about the redactions are not fully answered. Members of Congress are saying they don't have the complete information. And then it's that list, as you mentioned, of around 300 individuals, some of whom say they have no connection to Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of lawmakers accusing the DOJ of trying to muddy the water here. I'll read to you some of what we heard first from Eric Swalwell, the Democrat from California. He wrote on X, he was part of that list in the letter yesterday. He said, LOL, so one loser sends another loser a news article with my name on it, and the cover-up clan at the DOJ wants to put me in the same drawer as Donald Trump. Doesn't work that way. Trump is a friend of the pedos. I'm their worst nightmare. Now, again, Katie, it's important to note it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans as well. I want to read to you part of what Nancy Mace said. She's the Republican congresswoman from South Carolina. She was one of the 4 Republicans, by the way, who signed on to the discharge petition in order to set this entire process in place of releasing the Epstein files. She took concern with some of the arguments and the reasonings for the redactions that were in that letter, saying, quote, citing work product privilege will not save the DOJ from releasing all the Epstein files. She says that she's going to continue to call for the release of all the files. The DOJ has said it's had around 6 million on hand. Only 3.5 million have been released. So, Katie, to sum it all up, a lot of lawmakers were looking to this letter before it was released for it to clear some things up. I think it's only led to more questions.
So, Fallon, how much of the documents have been released? I mean, is it all of them? DOJ says it's all of them, but Channel 4 in the UK is saying it's only 2%, according to a metadata analysis that they did. I don't know if they're accurate, but what do we know?
Of course, and we don't have specific reporting on what they're reporting, but I want to be really careful about that UK report because you'll remember that some of the stuff that's privileged from the release are things like child pornography, things that depict death. So those are typically video files, which are large, and I think that's what they're getting at with that 2% possibly. But at this point, the DOJ has released 3.5 million files. They had about 6 overall. They've decided to withhold some. But in this letter, they're really detail light on why they've withheld things. They talk about what the law entails and what they're allowed to withhold and the fact that they redacted things and the legal rationale for that. But they leave out details on specific redactions and why they redacted certain things. This summary is extremely broad. And so we don't fully know what they're still holding
so I looked
up
Kurt Cobain. I was wondering, why is Kurt Cobain on this list? He's in a PDF of a book that Epstein appeared to have. You have Elvis being mentioned. This is the editor of an online publication called Ultimate Classic Rock, claims Elvis was mentioned in an email, a business pitch that cited a project using Presley's music as a previous success. I mean, they're just randomly in there. They have nothing to do with Epstein.
And that's the thing. This list of the 300 plus names of those government officials and politically facing people has become the buzziest part of this, because really this is where the most meat is. But it's, as Ro Khanna said, muddying the water. So you have all these names of people who are actual government officials who may have been convicted of, or not convicted, but maybe under investigation for potential wrongdoing. But then you have people like Marilyn Monroe and Janis Joplin. And I was curious, so I looked into the files to see what are those people doing there. Marilyn Monroe, Jeffrey Epstein received a press invite to a screening of My Week with Marilyn starring Michelle Williams. That's why Marilyn Monroe is in there. Janis Joplin is in there because of a newsletter. And at the bottom of the newsletter, there is a playlist with like 20 songs from the 60s and 70s, and it has Janis Joplin, Piece of My Heart.
So what's the point of releasing a letter with all these names in it, if it's not to muddy the water, as Ro Khanna said? And I ask you this, Joe, because you're writing today about how just the mere fact that you are mentioned in the Epstein files, or your name appears in it, can lead to some bad days.
More than that. I mean, the example that I used in my article is Casey Wasserman.
Yeah.
Who's about to sell his agency because he's going to lose all his clients because they're leaving, saying, you're a bad guy. You consorted with Giselle Maxwell, who's a criminal and is in prison, and therefore you're associated with Epstein. And now, unlike Janis Joplin, there really are some back and forths between Ghislaine Maxwell.
What's the extent of the back and forth? Explain it.
Well, first of all, he did go on Epstein's jet. But why? Because in 2002, he went on a trip to Africa with the Bill Clinton Foundation, and Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton loves to borrow private jets, as we all know. And that's why that's the only time he was ever on the jet, and that's the only time he ever met Jeffrey Epstein. He had a 2-month flirtation. Whether it went beyond that, nobody knows. But in 2003, in March and April 2003, you see a bunch of very flirty emails between Maxwell and Casey Wasserman. He was 28. He was married. It should be between him and his wife. 23 years ago, nobody knew Ghislaine Maxwell was a criminal. Nobody knew.
This is 2003.
2003.
It's not. It's before Jeffrey Epstein is convicted.
Before there was any.
The flirtation, in retrospect, looks gross.
Yeah.
You can argue it's gross because he was married at the time, but you're not arguing that it's criminal and that the idea that he's somehow complicit in the Epstein.
Correct.
Cover up and Epstein sex crimes is wrong.
And there's a lot of people like that where they're being pilloried when their connection to Epstein or Maxwell is really tangential, and in some cases it's really hard to know what's real and what's not.
So what do you make of that letter from Pam Bondi?
Well, I mean, muddying the waters is kind of the game for them. The more that they can have you looking at Janis Joplin and not looking at Donald Trump.
Or Howard Lutnick.
I mean, Howard Lutnick, who knows how close he was to Epstein, but his big problem really is he lied.
Yeah.
I mean, if he had just said, yeah, once upon a time I went to the island for an hour in the afternoon, if he had said that in the beginning, it'd be a lot different.
Do we know how closely the White House is working with Bondi on this?
How closely, how often they speak? No. But I mean, just adding to the list of the people who work in this White House and have had some kind of association with Epstein is also Tom Barrack, who had more than even potentially Howard Lutnick. That's the president's special envoy to Syria and also his ambassador to Turkey. And he had ongoing communications with Epstein, even beyond Epstein's conviction and after Trump first won in 2016. So there are a lot of people here that the administration is trying not to talk about. I know our own Jake Traylor on Friday tried to ask the president when he was leaving the White House about Howard Lutnick, and the president looked at him and then fully ignored the question and moved on and had the benefit of, Marine One's blades
chopper
going.
Noise,
chopper noise to be able to ignore it. But in terms of how much the president is talking directly to Pam Bondi, I can't say. I mean, we have obviously seen him very publicly say over and over again that he does not want to talk about this anymore, that he wants to move on, that he wants the country to move on. You saw that Pam Bondi went so far as to try to point to the Dow and has become an internet meme over saying the Dow is at 50,000 during the hearing to try to say we should be talking about other things beyond Epstein. But this isn't going away.
The survivors have now offered multiple times to talk to DOJ, and Pam Bondi in the beginning of that hearing last week said that she was open to talking to all of them. Do we know if anybody has yet had an interview or even scheduled an interview or had communication with DOJ about talking potentially to them?
At this point, we don't. She has not talked to survivors. Survivors were extremely upset after last week's hearing about the way that they felt she completely disregarded them, even when they were sitting in that room. So at this point, it does not seem like there's anything on the books.
The core issue is how many other men had sex with underage girls that were handed to them by Jeffrey Epstein. That's what the Justice Department should be investigating. And if they were doing that, so much of this other stuff would go away.
Why aren't they?
That's the question. They're so uninterested. And Todd Blanche basically said we're uninterested when he released the latest tranche of Epstein emails. They don't want to do it. They don't want to go there.